I stayed far longer than I should have because leaving felt like dying. That's not a metaphor. It's the closest description I have for the fear that kept me where I was. Leaving didn't feel like change or freedom or even loss. It felt like erasing myself. Like stepping into a void where nothing familiar would recognize me. So I stayed. At first, staying felt noble. Responsible. I told myself that endurance was proof of character. That real adults don't run when things become uncomfortable. They adjust. They compromise. They learn how to live with less. I learned quickly. My life didn't collapse. That's the part people don't understand. There was no explosion, no betrayal dramatic enough to justify escape. Everything functioned. I showed up. I smiled when appropriate. I fulfilled expectations that were never clearly stated but always silently enforced. From the outside, I looked composed. Inside, something was suffocating slowly. I told myself that every life contains discomfort, that dissatisfaction is just a phase you outgrow. I believed that if I waited long enough, my resistance would fade and acceptance would settle in naturally. I mistook numbness for peace. Numbness is efficient. It allows you to live without asking dangerous questions. It dulls the edges of longing. It turns days into manageable units instead of experiences. Once I learned how to numb myself, survival became easy. Too easy. Days passed without friction. Weeks folded into months. I stopped marking time by events and started measuring it by how tired I felt at the end of each day. Nothing felt urgent. Nothing demanded a decision. That should have scared me. It didn't. What scared me was the thought of leaving. Whenever the idea surfaced, quietly, usually at night, my body reacted before my mind could rationalize it. My chest tightened. My breathing became shallow. My thoughts scattered. Leaving felt like stepping off a cliff without knowing whether there was ground below. So I pushed the thought away. I told myself I couldn't afford uncertainty. That starting over was for people who had already failed. That abandoning a stable life was reckless. Immature. Dangerous. Those words sounded wise. People around me reinforced them without meaning to. They said I was strong. Patient. Someone who could endure. They admired my ability to hold things together. Their approval wrapped around my fear and made it feel justified. Inside, something withered. I noticed it in small ways. How often I felt detached during conversations. How achievements landed flat. How rest never restored me, because exhaustion wasn't the problem. Absence was. I began waking up already tired, as if I had spent the night bracing myself against my own life. I carried a constant pressure in my chest, not anxiety, not sadness, just the awareness that something essential wasn't being used. I avoided silence because silence asked questions. At night, when distractions ran out, I felt it most clearly. The sense that I was living in a life that didn't require me to be fully present. That I could disappear emotionally and nothing would stop. The structure held without me. That realization terrified me. But not enough to make me leave. Leaving felt final. Staying felt survivable. And when survival becomes your priority, everything else looks irresponsible by comparison. I convinced myself that this was adulthood. That intensity fades. That people who claim to feel alive all the time are exaggerating or lying. I believed that wanting more was childish, and maturity meant learning how to tolerate less. So I tolerated. Years passed that way. Quietly. Efficiently. I didn't lose my life in one moment. I lost it in pieces small enough to ignore. Each day, I gave up a little more of myself to avoid the terror of change. The truth I avoided was simple and brutal. Leaving scared me more than staying was killing me. And that is how people disappear without ever leaving. One night, lying awake in the dark, a thought surfaced that I could no longer push away. If I stay, nothing will explode. If I stay, nothing will end. If I stay, this will be my entire life. Not the worst life. Not a tragic life. Just a smaller one. That was the moment I realized I wasn't staying because it was right. I was staying because leaving felt like dying, and I had been confusing fear with wisdom for a very long time. After that realization, I was staying because leaving felt like dying. Fear stopped feeling abstract. It became precise. I could see its shape in my daily choices, in the way I structured my life to make escape unnecessary. I began to notice how carefully I had learned to survive inside something that was slowly hollowing me out. How many small agreements I made every day to keep everything exactly as it was. I chose my words. I adjusted my reactions. I avoided topics that made my chest tighten. I smoothed over discomfort before it had time to grow into honesty. I wasn't trapped. I was cooperating. People around me never questioned it. Why would they? Cooperation looks like maturity. Endurance looks like strength. Silence looks like peace. I had become very good at performing stability, and stability is rarely interrogated. Inside, my body was protesting. Sleep stopped helping. I woke up already tired, already braced, as if the day ahead required me to shrink myself into something manageable. Ordinary moments felt heavy, standing in line, driving familiar routes, listening to conversations I could predict before they happened. I told myself it was stress. Everyone is stressed. But stress comes from effort. What I felt came from suppression. I realized how much energy it took to stay. To remain agreeable. To keep convincing myself that this life was enough. Staying required constant vigilance. Don't want too much, don't hope too loudly, don't imagine alternatives. Leaving would have been one terrifying decision. Staying was thousands of quiet ones. Late at night, I replayed memories not with nostalgia, but with suspicion. I searched for the moment when staying stopped being a temporary choice and became my identity. There was no dramatic turning point. No explosion. No betrayal. Just a long series of tolerable days. I almost left. I almost spoke the truth. I almost admitted how much this was costing me. Each time, fear intervened with logic. It reminded me of everything I would lose. Familiarity. Approval. The safety of knowing exactly what tomorrow would look like. Fear told me that starting over would erase me, that I wouldn't recognize myself on the other side. And I believed it. The moral dilemma grew heavier with time. If I stayed, nothing catastrophic would happen. That was the promise of endurance. I would remain functional, dependable, intact. I would age quietly inside a life that demanded nothing from me emotionally. If I left, everything would become uncertain. I would have to face explanations I didn't have. I would have to confront the years I had already given away. I would risk discovering that I had waited too long to build anything else. That possibility terrified me. Some nights, the idea of disappearing crossed my mind. Not dying, disappearing. Stepping out of the life that was slowly erasing me. Starting somewhere I wasn't already known as the person who could endure indefinitely. The thought scared me. It also made me breathe deeper. That contradiction stayed with me. I couldn't unfeel it. I couldn't unsee what staying was doing to me. Endurance had stopped being strength. It had become avoidance disguised as virtue. I tried to argue myself back into staying. I reminded myself how dangerous it is to leave stability. How many people would trade places with me? How irresponsible it would be to disrupt everything for a feeling I couldn't fully explain. Those arguments had always worked before. Now they sounded rehearsed. Then came a moment so ordinary it almost passed unnoticed. Someone asked me, casually, without accusation, "Do you ever think about leaving?" The question hit me harder than any confrontation. I felt my body react instantly, tight chest, shallow breath, the familiar panic. Before my mind could filter it, I realized the answer was already there. I thought about leaving all the time. That was the truth I had been hiding even from myself. Not occasionally. Not abstractly. Constantly. Like a quiet signal I had learned to ignore. Leaving wasn't an impulse, it was a persistent awareness I kept suppressing. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was panicking, but because something in me refused to keep cooperating. I realized my life wasn't breaking. It was being traded away slowly for the illusion of safety. For the first time, staying felt like an active decision instead of a default. And once you see that, neutrality disappears. Every day you remain becomes a choice to continue shrinking. I didn't know yet what I would do. But I knew this: if leaving felt like dying, maybe that was because the version of me that existed here was already disappearing. And if I didn't move soon, there would be nothing left that recognized fear as anything other than home. I didn't leave because the fear disappeared. I left because I finally understood what the fear was protecting. It wasn't protecting my future. It was protecting the version of me that could survive without asking to live. The moment wasn't dramatic. There was no speech, no closure, no perfect alignment of circumstances. I didn't wait for confidence. I waited until staying required more violence against myself than leaving ever could. That was the line. The day I crossed it felt strangely ordinary. I woke up with the same weight in my chest, the same dull anticipation of repetition, and something inside me refused to keep negotiating. Not loudly. Not bravely. It simply stopped cooperating. I realized I had spent years asking the wrong question. I kept asking, can I endure this? And the answer was always yes. The question I finally allowed myself to ask was different: what am I becoming by enduring this? The answer scared me more than leaving ever had. Leaving didn't feel like freedom. It felt like grief. I grieved familiarity. I grieved the identity I had built around endurance. I grieved the approval that came from being the one who never disrupted anything. I also grieved time. Time I couldn't reclaim. Time spent convincing myself that survival was the same as loyalty, that patience was the same as wisdom, that fear was the same as responsibility. The first days after leaving were disorienting. Silence was louder. Uncertainty was physical. Without the structure that had numbed me, emotions returned unfiltered. Fear was the first to arrive, sharp, relentless, convincing. It told me I had made a mistake. That I had destroyed something workable for nothing more than discomfort. Some days, I believed it. But beneath the fear, something unfamiliar appeared: presence. I could feel myself reacting again instead of shrinking. Even doubt felt alive. Even regret had edges. Nothing was flat anymore. Life after leaving wasn't easier. It was uneven. I stumbled. I questioned myself constantly. I wondered if I had waited too long, if the damage was already done, if I was simply exchanging one slow death for another kind of suffering. But this suffering responded to movement. It changed when I changed. That made all the difference. I learned something that surprised me: staying doesn't always mean strength. Sometimes it means refusing to acknowledge that your life is asking for more than endurance. Sometimes it means cooperating with your own disappearance because it feels safer than stepping into the unknown. I had mistaken familiarity for safety. I had mistaken fear for wisdom. Leaving didn't save me instantly. It didn't repair everything. Some losses were permanent. Some doors never reopened. I carry that knowledge quietly now. But I also carry something I didn't have before. Integrity. My days stopped slipping through me unnoticed. Even hard moments stayed with me because I was actually there to feel them. I wasn't watching my life anymore. I was inside it, making imperfect choices, accepting imperfect outcomes, living with consequences that belonged to me. I grieved what I had lost. That grief still visits me. I mourn the parts of myself that learned how to disappear politely, the years spent shrinking to survive, the life that might have been if I had left sooner. But I no longer confuse grief with regret. Regret comes from knowing you could have chosen and didn't. Grief comes from choosing and accepting the cost. I chose. If you're listening to this and telling yourself that you're managing, that things aren't bad enough to justify change, that leaving feels too frightening to consider, listen carefully to what your fear is protecting. Ask yourself whether your life requires your presence or merely your endurance. Because there is a difference between staying alive and staying awake. I stayed because leaving felt like dying. But staying was the slower death. Leaving didn't make my life perfect. It made it honest. And honesty, even when it hurts, even when it's late, even when it's incomplete, is still better than a life spent surviving quietly until nothing is left that remembers how to leave.